Boom, I'm in the room. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Everyday Conversations Regarding Mental Health. Now, you're here because there's nothing on the telly, and I'm coming to you live from the old Hill Manor. Now, just give a quick plug to the quiz channel. If you want to do a quiz, if you've missed the quizzes, you can go back and do them on catch up, and they're over on the old live stream awesome quiz channel. But this channel is all about mental health, mental well-being, taking the stigma out of mental health. Now, I've got an awesome guest on tonight. He has pioneered a revolutionary treatment for the likes of PTSD and stuff like that. He's going to tell you all about it. So, without too much further ado, let's bring in my guest. Dr. Henderson, good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome. So,
thank you for having me.
No, you're most welcome. Now, can you tell us a little bit about what you do, the work that you do, and how you go about it, how you've developed what you're doing nowadays to help people with their mental well-being? So, you've got the floor.
Oh, great. Thank you. So, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm also a PhD research scientist. And so I come about psychiatry from a brain perspective. And I very quickly became frustrated with, all right, well, you've got depression. Here, take this pill, take this SSRI, take this pill for the rest of your life. About a 19% chance that it's going to make you feel better. But it won't make you feel completely better. It'll just make you feel a little bit better. And that was very frustrating for me, whether it was PTSD or depression or, worse, if you have a traumatic brain injury, there's no treatment at all. It's just like, okay, well, you've got a brain injury, have a nice life. We can't do anything for you. And the work that brought me into thinking about different treatments was because I started doing functional neuroimaging, what are called SPECT scans, SPECT, which is short for single photon emission computed tomography. So you can see why it's much easier to say SPECT. And these functional brain scans show how the brain is, some parts are underactive, some parts are not working as well as they should, some parts are overactive, they're doing too much, or they're mucking up the works by being overactive. And then there are parts of the brain that are cooking along just fine. And whether in the case of traumatic brain injury, it's quite obvious, there's a part of the brain that is injured and therefore it's not working very well. But we're also seeing, distinct patterns of dysfunction in things like depression and PTSD and bipolar disorder and ADHD, et cetera, et cetera. So, out of that work of diagnosing people and treating people based on what we saw on the functional brain scans, I started to work with people on what can we do for traumatic brain injury. And this really led me into this approach of activating neuroplasticity in the brain. And what's neuroplasticity? Well, the brain has its own ability to adapt and accommodate and adjust and rebuild things within the brain. If you can stimulate that process and turn it on and jazz it up, then you can see improvement in things like traumatic brain injury. And so what was brought to my attention about 10, 12 years ago was the work using infrared light. And infrared light, certain wavelengths of infrared light, activate the mitochondria. And mitochondria are the little organelles inside cells that produce energy. And the light would stimulate the mitochondria. They'd make more energy, but they'd also send signals down to the chromosomes, down to the DNA, and turn on growth factors that drove this neuroplasticity that I was talking about. And so all of a sudden, they were showing in animal models that, yeah, you can take a a bunch of mice, and you can whack them in the head with an instrument that gives them exactly the same traumatic brain injury. Treat half the mice with infrared light, the other half leave them alone, and you'd see that, look, the brain injury is smaller. And in fact, there's a whole lot of new synapses being made, and dendrites are growing. And in fact, the animal's neurological function, they're able to walk on little beams and things that the animals that got the same brain injury and didn't get treated couldn't do. So both at the level of molecular biology and at the level of the size of the lesion and at the level of the function of the animals, they were seeing that infrared light all by itself, just light, was making these animals better. There was some early work looking at low power infrared light to treat people. And the problem with that is that, our skulls, mine especially, is considerably thicker than that of a mouse. So getting infrared light through the scalp and the skull of a human takes more energy. And so what we did is we went into the lab and we sorted that out. We figured out how much light does it take to get through scalp and skull of a human and 3 centimeters into the brain. And so that was the development of what is called multi-watt infrared light therapy. Now, the light that we use is actually a laser. So don't think Star Trek and things blowing up. This is coherent light, and coherent light is able to penetrate tissue better. And so we're able to actually reach the brain and treat it. And so we have patients now, many, hundreds of patients that we have treated for traumatic brain injury, in which they have a SPECT scan before and after treatment, and you see improvement in the brain function, and they experience improvement. And I can go through all that if we have time. But we also saw that they would get less depressed. And so we started looking at depression as a distinct entity. And we see that, in fact, infrared light is a great treatment for depression. It's also a great treatment for PTSD. Probably my favorite patient is a patient who had PTSD from a naval attack that was 49 years prior to when he was treated. And he had suffered with PTSD all of that time. He came, he got 6 treatments, it was gone. He no longer had the panic attacks. He no longer hid in the basement when the jets flew over. He just was happy and living his life and no longer suicidal. It was striking. We've extended this treatment now. We're treating post-COVID fatigue or long COVID. And some of our patients who have ADHD they're like suddenly, okay, yeah, my depression's better, doc, but I don't have ADHD anymore. I don't need to take my stimulants anymore. So it's really quite remarkable. And some people are identifying this as the 5th branch of medicine. And I think this is where the revolution sort of is starting. So I'll stop there.
Wow. That sounds amazing. And this is already rolling out. How?
Yeah.
I mean, where's it rolling out to? Is it going countrywide? Is it going worldwide? Where can people
worldwide
get this treatment?
Yeah. So right now, I'm based in Denver. Our clinic is in Denver, and we're using. This is where you can get that multi-watt treatment. There are people who are selling these low-power infrared light devices that you can literally buy for a couple $1,000 US and put in your home. The problem is, it doesn't get through the scalp and skull. It's doing what's called indirect photobiomodulation or indirect infrared light treatment. So, in terms of what's available worldwide at this point is this indirect low power treatment. But our goal, my goal as a clinician who wants to help people, is to get our multi-watt infrared light treatment out worldwide. We had to start with, the United States. And, so far there's just the one clinic.
Wow. So, and is this being recognised throughout the industry as a bona fide treatment that will progress, and more clinics will take it up and start using it?
That's a great question, and it's the as a scientist, I mean, I want to have those double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials saying yes, indeed, we took 50 people and 25 got treated and 25 got a sham.
Mm.
We didn't turn the laser on, and show that there's a difference. And those kinds of studies for like 60 people, that's about $2 million. And at this point, there's not the investment for those kinds of large scale studies. Now, there have been some small scale studies done out of Harvard, for example. My colleague Paula Casano, and he has shown using a lower power infrared light that, yeah, depression gets a little bit better. It
Mm.
was clinically significant in the terms of the fact that it met statistical criteria, but it wasn't like a huge aha experience for a lot of these patients. And that's the difference, again, about power. So right now in the field, there's sort of this schism of people who are working with this low power stuff, and then those of us who are working with multi-watt or high power infrared light therapy,
Mm.
directly reaching the brain. So, we have grand rounds at Harvard, and there are many clinicians publishing in the field of infrared photobiomodulation, and the field is progressing, and there are a number of patents. I have 2 patents, and 2 more pending. And, it's an evolving field. So
Mm.
right now, bona fide, what does bona fide mean? Bona fide could mean, okay, it's accepted by the government and in the insurance companies, and they're reimbursing for it. And we're not at that point.
Mm.
And it's interesting when you look at it as a comparison, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which is FDA approved in the US for depression, and is reimbursed by insurance companies, sort of. But what initially led to that being FDA approved was about 200 patients. That was all it took.
Wow.
So it's an interesting time right now of an
Mm.
evolving treatment.
Well, there's certainly no lack of patients that are suffering from PTSD that you can get hold of. Um, the military have one or two that are that are
Yes,
available
exactly.
for testing on. I'm sure.
Mhm.
Um, so for PTSD, let's be. I mean, I've seen quite a bit of it. I've got a little bit of it myself and been
Mhm.
treated for it. How does it work for somebody that's got complex PTSD that's
Right, right.
properly messed up with stuff that they've seen and done that in their past that's really affected them? How would it benefit them from going forward and having the treatment?
Well, so at first understanding what's going on neurophysiologically in PTSD. And we actually studied this and published a couple of papers back in 2015, in which we looked at SPECT scans of people who had TBI, traumatic brain injury, versus PTSD. Now, clinically, they're almost indistinguishable. People with PTSD have sleep problems. So do people with TBI. They have irritability. So do people with TBI. They have mood dysregulation. So do people with TBI. They have difficulty, staying employed and staying engaged in social networks. So do people with TBI. I mean, only the flashbacks really sort of distinguish PTSD from TBI at a symptom level.
Mm.
But if you look at a brain scan, if you look at a SPECT scan, I mean, they're diametrically opposed. PTSD, the parts of the brain that we're focusing on are way overactive. In TBI, they're way underactive. I
Mm.
mean, it's night and day. There's no confusion. Um, Now, in terms of what the infrared light does, so PTSD has both this overactive areas of the brain. They're being driven by sort of that repetitive intrusive thinking, and that the kind of the thinking about, oh, if only I had done this, 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 my buddies wouldn't be dead. Uh, that kind of cyclical and spiraling thinking. But there's also a neurophysiological poison in PTSD, not unlike in depression. And there are parts of the brain that get smaller in PTSD. The hippocampus, for example, gets smaller in PTSD. It also gets smaller in depression. Now, fortunately, that degenerative change is reversible. And so anything that drives neuroplasticity can reverse that PTSD. So this is where, what is fascinating about ketamine, which is a kind of a revolutionary treatment for depression, and now being recognized for PTSD, is that ketamine also drives that neuroplasticity. But in the case of the infrared light, what we're seeing is by turning on that neuroplasticity, we start to help patients to undo the neurophysiological damage in their brain. And therefore, their brain functions better and therapy sticks. Because if your brain is damaged, you can't expect therapy to stick. Make sense?
Does make.
So, in our patients, and we've treated a number of veterans and a number of first responders who have PTSD, and they see dramatic improvement. Literally, I can't tell you how many wives have said to me, "You saved his life."
So, how long does the treatment take? So, somebody comes in to you with chronic PTSD,
Mhm.
and they start a treatment. How long? How many sessions do they need? How long does it take to before you start seeing some positive changes?
Yeah, yeah. Great question. So again, everyone's an individual, so it's not precise. I mentioned that veteran who he had 49 years of horrible PTSD, and he got better in 6 treatments. Now, he had a car accident and he came back and got 2 more treatments, but that was it, 8 treatments. And then we have folks, where 30 is a more realistic number. And, then we have patients who, I have one first responder, and he came and got 20 treatments, and then about every 2 months he comes back and gets a treatment. And what drives that for him, how he makes that decision, okay, it's time to come back in, are the headaches. So again, it varies from person to person. The treatments themselves take about 30 minutes. And so if someone was like, and we have lots of people who do this, they fly into Denver, they, get 6, 8 treatments. They go back home to Florida or New York or wherever. And then, after a month, they come back and get another 6, 8 treatments. And what's interesting is that during the time in between, they get better. Because it's not just neuroplasticity doesn't happen just when the light is shining on your head. It continues. We're turning on a process that continues to unfold over the weeks subsequently.
Wow. So 6 or 8 treatments at half an hour ago. Is that done sort of over a few days, or is it over once a day? Is it once every other day, once a fortnight?
Yeah.
What's the sort of regime that you use when you're giving somebody the treatment?
Yeah, typically 2 to 3 times a week is what we'll do. You can't make neuroplasticity go a whole lot faster. You can turn it on, but you can't drive it.
Yeah.
Because neurons only grow a millimeter a day. You can't make that go any faster.
No.
So we'll do typically 2 to 3 treatments a week. Again, half hour each treatment. The treatments themselves are painless. People describe it as sort of you're laying down and we're have a handheld device that we're using on the forehead, and into the temple region. Or if the brain injury is back here, then we're getting back in through the hair. I will say that hair gets in the way of infrared light. And we actually showed that in a study. And so, we love it when the guy comes in and they're they've got the crew cut,
Follically
because
challenged.
the hair's out of the way. Those are the best. Absolutely, those are the best. The guys
Yeah.
who are bald, I love that, because like hair gets in the way. So when you
It
treat
says
me, you
giving them
had
a
to kind
short
of
back and shine.
there you go. Yeah. And what people experience is that they find it very relaxing. And some people afterwards are, kind of relaxed and like they've had a massage. And some people actually get energized, and sometimes it varies from day to day. So one of my patients, who was also a physician, and so keenly kind of observing the process, he said it was interesting. Like one day I felt kind of tired afterwards. Another day I was energized, and he's one of the patients who, like, he came to me after treatment 17. He said, "Doc, this is the weirdest thing. I don't need my Adderall anymore." And he's gone back and he's in a very busy clinic and he doesn't need a stimulant anymore. So his
Wow.
ADHD is gone.
So, are there any side effects that you've come across so far in the treatment?
Um, yeah. So with the first treatment, sometimes patients will have a headache. But after that, no. And the if we're like shooting to, the worst thing is that we don't get what we're after. For example, one of the areas that is emerging for this treatment is dementia and mild cognitive impairment. And that's a little tricky to measure. So how do you know if someone's memory is better? They're not asking the same question over and over again. There are some memory tests. But subjectively, patients will show objective improvement on memory, but their subjective experience is that their memory is not improved. And that's a tricky wicket, because, I can show them the data, but their
Yeah.
experience is, hey, this didn't make me better.
Mm.
So that's, I would say, is not necessarily a side effect, but it's like when people don't get what they're hoping for
Yeah.
in that memory function piece.
Yeah. I mean, lots of people have memory function anyway, and it's difficult to really tell whether you can remember something. I mean, even just a
Mhm.
perfectly normal person can struggle at
Mhm.
remembering what they did yesterday, but can recall
Correct.
stuff from years ago like it was yesterday. So I
Right.
mean, yeah, I kind of get that. Um, so how would somebody, say from outside the US, contact you uh, and come over for the treatment, and
Mhm.
what would it
That's
cost them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So certainly, our website has a link so that you can get to us directly, and that's neuroluminance.com. Neuro, Neuro hyphen luminance, LUMINANCE.com.
Yeah, I'll put all that in
And
the description.
okay, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And that's also got a little page that has my book on it as well. And the as far as coming over and getting treated, and we've had patients who've come from all over the U.S. and several other countries as well, down from Canada, for example, et cetera. And we will help with sort of making sure you get into an Airbnb that's like safe.
Mm.
And then the treatments themselves, if you kind of plan for 20 treatments, the treatments themselves are $300 a piece US. And so 20 treatments, that's 6,000 US.
Mm.
We do some testing, so if you want to get a spec scan, that's sort of a separate deal. We don't have a scanner in our office. We have people
Yet.
go to the local hospital yet. Yeah, my colleagues and I have actually discussed that, and I'm very active in the brain imaging community. Um, but what we do, in addition to the SPECT scan, is a QEEG. They're cheap. They don't have any dangerous. There's no radiation with a
Mm.
QEEG. And we can do them multiple times. So we'll do a baseline QEEG. We also do balance testing, because everybody with a traumatic brain injury has balance problems. We do a pupil reflex test, which is a great sort of um, signal of how the unconscious brain is functioning, the brain stem and the parts of the
Mm.
brain that we don't voluntarily control. We do a bunch of cognitive tests, paper and pencil tests. And then, after 10 treatments, we repeat those tests. And then we say, okay, look, here's the progress. And then after 10 more treatments, we repeat them again and say, okay, here's the progress. And so that's how we really figure out, do you need 20? Do you need 30? How many treatments do you need?
Mm.
Based on that testing, we use objective measures.
Brilliant. So you own to helping anybody, and say $300 a session plus. I mean, for how many sessions you have, it could work quite well. And would there be any sort of veterans discount? Say, would
That's
you?
yeah, it's absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. Veterans are really important to us at Neuro-Luminance and the Neurolaser Foundation. And the Neurolaser Foundation is a nonprofit that does research and then subsidizes the treatment of veterans and first responders. So we can't 100% subsidize, but we can subsidize part of the treatment, usually around 50%. And so we've had a bunch of veterans come through with that program. So we've been able to help them, shave the cost of that for them.
Because I guess veterans and first responders, they're in the higher bracket of getting complex PTSD. They're the guys that are recognised as suffering it more than your average Joe on the street.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, the guys and gals that we've treated who are first responders and veterans, probably one of my favorite is a police officer from Colorado Springs, and she had horrible PTSD as well as a concussion related to sort of one or two incidences in her career as as a police officer. And I'm talking to her about the treatment, and I say, hair sort of gets in the way, so maybe we can trim your hair on the sides a little bit so I can get to your temporal lobes. She shows up for her first treatment, Sinead O'Connor. She just shaved it all off. And she said, why not? Hair will grow back. I want my
Yeah,
brain back.
yeah,
So I just
absolutely.
love that.
That's a great story. So anybody that's coming over for some treatment, you suggest having a head shave.
Well, again, I mean, hair gets in the way. I'll just leave it at
Yeah.
that. We work around it, but hair gets in the
So
way.
your book then. Tell us a little bit about your book, and is it written for the layman, or is it written
Yeah.
for the scientist?
So, Brighter Days Ahead is the name of the book. You can see it back here. Well, okay, over that
Yeah,
side. There it is.
over there.
And Brighter Days Ahead is really written for the layperson, and it was sort of I kept finding myself saying the same thing to patients and prospective patients and folks I was talking to over and over again. And so during the pandemic, I had lots of time on my hand. I sat down and just started writing it all out. And what happened was that I couldn't help myself. I had to go into the science. And so the book ended up sort of being a layperson and then intense science, layperson discussion, intense science. And so what I did is I took all that intense science and I put it at the back of the book. And so they're what I call them deep dives. And so if you want to get into the molecular biology of depression, or you want to get into what MRI scans show of that hippocampus getting smaller in depression, you can see all that. It's in the deep dives. If you get curious and you want to learn about, how science works, I talk about how science really works in the deep dives. And so the book is really written for the layperson. And there's lots of examples of patient stories of how they responded. And what I do is I get at the fact that depression is not about not enough serotonin. We've been told, oh, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and you don't have enough serotonin, so let's put you on an SSRI, which increases serotonin levels. Well, the reality is that Prozac, fluoxetine, increases serotonin in about 2 hours. So why don't you feel less depressed in 2 hours? Because it's not about serotonin levels. I mean, fluoxetine is used to treat PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. We know it as PMS. And you don't take it all month long. 5 days before your menstrual period, you start taking fluoxetine, and it pumps up your serotonin levels so that when the progesterone drops and the serotonin drops behind it, you prevent that from happening. And you sail through that rough spot, hormonal rough spot, without all the anxiety and brain fog and moodiness that can occur. So depression is not about insufficient serotonin. And that's been proven now over and over again in big research studies published in Lancet just published it last year, a big meta-analysis showing serotonin is not related. It doesn't correlate with depression. So what the book talks about is what is really going on. And it's this degenerative change that happens in the brain. So you look at the neurons of a depressed rat, and the dendrites, that little tree-like thing that neurons have that looks like a big, massive oak tree. Well, in a depressed animal, they look like pruned rose bushes in the winter. And then after treatment, they arborize and branch and make connections and make new circuits. All that stuff gets restored. And I also talk about the fact that, I'm a psychiatrist, but I got to tell you, I think psychiatry is just a whole lot of malarkey. There is so much gobbledygook now in psychiatry. And a lot of it, at least in the US, is driven by the insurance companies. Oh, well, you had to have a diagnosis code, and you had to have this procedure code, and you can only see the patient for 15 minutes because that's all we're going to pay for.
Yeah.
That's nonsense. So what happens is that everybody who is sad or everybody who's fatigued all the time gets the label of depression. And we put them on Prozac or another SSRI, and we hope they get better, and they don't. And we see them once a month, and we charge them money, and we give them more pills. And it goes on and on and on, and the people live a miserable life. And that's nuts. So part of what's going on in the book is that I really talk about that issue. And I talk about that ketamine, which is this very powerful anesthetic that also drives that neuroplasticity I was talking about. Ketamine works in my hands, in my clinic, for 72% of the people. So it's a 72% response rate, not a 19% response rate that you have with Prozac. And but that 30%, that 28% of people who don't get better drive me crazy. I want to I want to solve the puzzle. I want to know what's going on. So, I found that many of them, the secret's in the genetics. And so if I understand their genetics, then I can find the right medicine. And so, I'm putting people on things like lithium. And lithium, oh my gosh, that's horrifying. Oh, lithium, that's that's a bad drug because it's got such a bad rep, right? But low doses of lithium, I mean, I have people who have their lithium levels are undetectable, but their depression is gone because it works on a pathway that they have, and it works much better. And the pathway is the GSK3 pathway, has nothing to do with serotonin. Or the patients have, the people who don't respond, who have depression that doesn't get better, they have chronic fatigue syndrome. And what is chronic fatigue syndrome? Well, it's actually a viral infection. And so by treating them with an antiviral, their depression goes away. And rather than treating them with an antidepressant. And in fact, I treat patients worldwide with chronic fatigue syndrome. And that's my next book. It will be about chronic fatigue syndrome.
Uh-huh.
The last thing, of course, is traumatic brain injury. And I can't tell you how, I ask every patient at least twice if they've ever had a head bump, if they've ever had a concussion, if they've ever gotten their bell rung. You play rugby, you've gotten your bell rung a few times. There's no
Once or
way
twice.
around it, right? And
Yeah.
the research shows that it just takes one head bump. And American football players, they have thousands of these head bunks.
Yeah, but
And
they're
so,
protected with an helmet, aren't they?
well,
Rugby, I'm protected by my hair.
there you go. That's right. And again, it's good for blocking infrared light, but not so good for blocking an elbow.
Yeah.
So, by treating traumatic brain injury, again, using this multi-watt infrared light, I have patients who, have a lifetime of depression and it goes away because we actually treated what was wrong with them, not the label that we'd given them.
Mm. I think for far too long the medical possession, can't even say the word now, profession
There you go.
have followed the same path all the time. They because the book says this, that they've kept it on going. Instead of trying to fix something that's broken, they just keep doing the same thing again. A bit like politicians as well. I mean,
Yeah.
they carry on doing the same thing. What is so? So it's changing that attitude and the behaviour of the clinicians to look at different ways of treating and to look at an individual rather than a whole raft of different people. I guess
Correct.
that's the way forward. Like
Mhm.
like everybody's an individual, and like you were saying, some people respond to some drugs, some don't, some respond to different things for different conditions. But it's identifying those people and what would work for them, and I'm sure you'll get there eventually.
That's the hope, that we can get to the point where we have individualized medicine that really takes the entire individual into account.
Mm.
Psychiatry is, and my colleague Daniel Lehman says this many times. He says, psychiatry is the only field that doesn't look at the organ they're treating.
Yeah.
Psychiatrists don't do brain scans generally. I mean, but
Well.
why would you not? The argument in ivory tower psychiatry is, well, brain scans, don't really show you anything, and the brain scans don't match up to the diagnoses because, like, someone who has depression, they have different looking brain scans. Well, because depression is not one thing,
Mm.
and that's the problem in psychiatry. Let's take depression. Let's stick with that example. So if you're depressed, you could have increased sleep or decreased sleep. You could have increased appetite, you could have decreased appetite. You could have increased activity, or you could be just laying on the couch like a slug. And you'd still have the same diagnosis. How does
Yeah.
that make any sense?
I guess this is groundbreaking stuff. This I think for your particular industry of psychiatry is really groundbreaking for psychiatrists to understand what's inside the noggin. First, they need to look inside it, and without taking it off, I guess taking the top off and looking at it, but do a scan that tells you a raft of different things.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody, like you were saying earlier, somebody who's got PTSD is different from somebody that's had a brain trauma,
Exactly.
but the symptoms are similar.
Very.
So why wouldn't psychiatrists want to do brain scans to see that and make an informed decision? Then I guess and then they can work out what the treatment would be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sounds logical, doesn't it? I mean,
It
and to
does.
the
Yeah,
average person, it's like, wow, why would you not do that?
Well, I suppose because it's at the end of the day, I suppose all these things are driven by money. It's if it's a money spinner, then it will catch on. But if you can make a lot of money from doing the bare minimum, why would you delve in deeper to make it difficult on yourself to make the same money? Yeah,
Yep.
I think that might have something to do with it. But that's me being a skeptic.
Well, I'll tell you. We mentioned TMS earlier, transcranial magnetic stimulation earlier. I don't have a TMS machine in my clinic. Why not? Because when TMS came out and they started doing studies, and we got beyond the few hundred patients they used to get FDA approval, the studies didn't bear up. The VA has done several studies where basically TMS was no better than placebo. So I'm not impressed by TMS, but they charge like $1,100 per treatment, and you have to get 40. And supposedly insurance covers that, but there's a copay, which is like 20-30%. So all of a sudden it gets very expensive very fast. And I'm not impressed that it's actually helping. And it's sorry.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
Fire truck.
Fire truck. Oh no, you haven't got wildfire starting.
Not yet, but for 20 years I was in an office that was one block from a fire station, and so I finally moved to a bigger building, and I'm a block and a half from a fire station.
And you're still getting whizzing past.
Yep, there you go.
Well, Dr. Henderson, thank you. This has been amazing. Really eye-opening, and I shall certainly be plugging what you do.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. So there you go. A treatment that's working for depression, for PTSD, for brain trauma, for all manner of stuff that's going inside the old noggin. So please, you find all the details of Dr. Henderson down in the description once I've put this up, and let me know what you think. Pop some comments in the chat. So there you have it. Thank you for joining me this evening. So until next time, TTFN. Ta-ta for now.